Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's Facility Show Connect Strat Talk webinar, where we'll be discussing the future of the workplace, a global perspective. Thank you to MRI Software for sponsoring today's discussion, which is broadcast by Facility Show, part of Informa Markets. I'm Chris Edwards, Group Director at Informa Markets, and I'll be introducing and moderating today's discussion. Just a few things to note before we get started. This webinar is designed to be interactive, so please do ask any questions you have and would like answered by panelists in the Q&A box to the top right of your screen. We've got several items for discussion already on the agenda for the early stages, but if you do have something to add, an opinion or a question, please submit away. Questions won't be made public, they'll come straight through to me separately, so don't be alarmed if you can't see anything coming through on the viewing platform itself. For a bit of context, some of the discussion will revolve around questions and themes that came out of a survey that MRI undertook earlier this year, looking at the views and opinions of real estate occupiers and landlords on returning to the workspace. The survey is available for you as a free download, courtesy of MRI. If you click on the download link, you should see it on the right-hand side of your screen. Lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please type any issues into the chat box and one of the technical team will be on hand to support you. If you'd like to watch the webinar back, or if you do have any internet issues during the session, don't worry. This will be available to watch back on demand throughout June and July. It is being recorded, so please feel free to log back on anytime in June or catch up between meetings on the platform to watch at your leisure. I'm delighted to be joined today by today's panel, each of whom can provide their own unique thoughts and expert insights into the future of the workplace. You can find out more about their roles in the bios if you scroll down on the left of your screen, but I'll just allow each of them to introduce themselves and then we'll get going. Andy, if I can come to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. My name's Andy Birch. I'm the Vice President of Product Marketing at MRI. Normally, that is a really fantastic role because it allows me to kind of travel around the world and get insights from our clients, review kind of what's going on in the market, and really kind of align client needs with what's going on with our kind of product strategy. Unfortunately, the last 15 months or so, I haven't been able to do that, but I'm certainly interested in getting feedback from anyone that's watching this today in terms of their views about what's going on in the facilities management space, and indeed in terms of what's going on specifically with their roles and responsibilities.
Thanks, Andy. And Nick, hi.
Hi, how are you, Chris? I'm Nicholas Frank. I am a marketing director at MRI Software for our occupier solutions, which have been very interesting in short order with some of the things that have been happening within the market recently. A year and a half ago, from a corporate occupier perspective, all of the talk was around lease obligations, lease compliance, but then obviously over the last year, workplace returning and return to work solutions have become at the forefront of what we've been talking about. And MRI is in a unique place where we see not only what the occupiers are needing, but also owner operators, because MRI services both sides of those with our solutions. So from that perspective, we've been working with a lot of different groups to provide leadership and knowledge base for our clients and for people in the industry, and excited to share some of that stuff with all of you today.
Thanks, both. And you mentioned that return to work, and here in the UK, we're set potentially a little under 2 weeks away from a full return to life without restrictions, all things being well, including a return to work. Now, I know there are a lot of people that would be listening that return to work will have already happened, but I think the large shift is due to come. Now, being a global organisation such as MRI, can you just give me a bit of an overview as to what you're seeing in the FM profession around the world, and particularly sort of with different regions at different stages of that return to work? Andy?
Yeah, sure. So really, the overriding kind of headline is that it's presenting kind of facilities managers with lots of challenges and lots of opportunities. I think the key thing here is how what essentially was a fairly kind of reactive position within the organization has changed to a very kind of strategic role in terms of assessment around balancing very kind of obvious safety and compliance requirements with the needs of the business, and ensuring that the business continue to with their kind of productivity and in terms of just their general kind of day-to-day working. So that's probably been the fundamental shift there. And so many FM people have been put in that position of being challenged to really assess what is available in terms of their kind of workspaces, and make decisions about how they can adequately get people to return to the office. In terms of that, there's some very kind of obvious things that we can talk about as we go through this session around the planning of the space itself, but it's much more than that. It's the whole kind of remit around the preparation of those workplaces, in terms of the access to the workplace, both in terms of within the office environment itself, so entry and exit procedures for getting into the office, but also in terms of just how people are going to get there in the first place, whether it makes sense to kind of stagger the working day and so on. What we're also seeing then is really that people are kind of scrambling a little bit in terms of having the right kind of information to hand. So there's a lack of data and visibility to support that changing role and the changing dynamics, because they, before would just, to some extent, and I'm not belittling the role itself, but to some extent, like an FM person would be somewhat reactive and responsible for maybe the regular maintenance of that building, responsible for cleaning, maintenance, that kind of thing. And it would just happen maybe every night when people went home. Now it's like, well, I need to know how many people are in the office that day. I need to know when someone's kind of vacated a meeting space. So there's additional challenges now in terms of understanding the requirements for those premises. You asked in terms of how that's changed from a global perspective. We obviously are seeing that certain markets are ahead of others, but generally speaking, all of them are faced with these same challenges on a global basis. What I will say, particularly as it relates to the UK, just the uniqueness of things like office spaces in places like London, where there's kind of restrictions in terms of that space and how you can kind of reconfigure, have really impacted whether people can return at all to the office. And Nick can talk a little bit more about MRI's kind of perspective in that regard, as he's been working much more closely with that team. But in general, we see some significant challenges there. In terms of other areas around this, what we've seen is, to some extent, previous initiatives prior to COVID have somewhat been put on hold. So things like initiatives around things like sustainability, to some extent, have taken like a back foot on this. And I think what we will see is, as we go through this process, that there will be a refocus on that, maybe as we go into 2022, generally across the globe. Interestingly, though, what COVID has meant is that as the organizations are evaluating their space, they're certainly taking advantage of technology to put in place appropriate measures around things like sensor technology, in terms of assessing whether a space is occupied or not. Again, the things that people can do to digitalize that environment, to make it safer, to improve things like HVAC, etc., have been put in place as people have been out of the office, and to some extent people have used that opportunity to refit the environments that they're working in.
So very much, as you say, you know, FM in the past is often the kind of the role in the background, and I think particularly there where you talk about compliance and safety, that's always been an important and integral part of that role. And really, what this pandemic does, therefore, is put that role front and centre, and actually, therefore, perhaps creates an opportunity for FMs to really kind of make their stamp on the organisation that they're working for. Nick, just then thinking about, again, though, that kind of global view, are there any regions that that you're doing work with, where you're seeing this return to work that you think the UK audience in particular should sit up and take notice of? Any lessons that you think could be learnt?
Yeah, Chris. So, you know, APAC, as Andy mentioned, is the first one that comes to mind. We have internally at MRI, we're just as much an occupier as our clients are. We have offices in Sydney. We have an office, I think we have 2 offices in New Zealand as well that have both opened back up, right? And what does it mean to open back up from our perspective? You know, there's different factors in play. Originally, we thought we'd be guided based on regulatory restrictions and guidelines, right? And something that may come down from the country level or from the regions level. But, you know, what we're starting to see is, as much as opening back up, being fully open, kind of eliminates some of those regulatory restrictions, there's a bit of corporate responsibility to provide that safety as well, right? And for us, being able to have a place that people and our employees feel safe to work at is paramount. And so, much like a lot of businesses that have started to open back up, we kicked that off with an employee survey and internally finding out what it is that our employees wanted in a safe environment. Started to utilize that to cater to the space planning components and how we might retrofit a building to fit the dynamics of a changing workplace. And I think what's really funny is we talk about return to work and we assume that means 100% capacity, right? But what we're experiencing and what we're seeing in APAC is businesses are open, but businesses aren't full, right? And we've utilized some of those offices to start to see how that might progress when we decide to open up our offices in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and throughout Europe and Africa as well. And not necessarily utilizing them as guinea pigs, so to speak, but actually utilizing these first couple of businesses that have opened up to learn what those changing dynamics of the office are. Because again, the office isn't necessarily completely full. We have employees now that want that hybrid experience. We have employees that want to work remote full time. And because of that, we have to now cater and change and start to modify the buildings that we occupy, right? And so that return to work concept is no longer a one and done for us. There's modifications that are necessary throughout the return and after that initial return. So, you know, we initially take all of that data that we get from our employees, from our own internal perspective, what our corporate responsibility is to our employees and to our visitors and to our guests, to make an environment that's safe, that adheres to regulatory protocols and things like that. But after that, we actually now start to see real data and real traffic numbers of the people that are coming in, what buildings, what meeting rooms, and what desks they're utilizing. And I'm sure we'll talk about hot desking or hoteling here later as well. But utilizing all of that different data to then make modifications to our present space, because it's going to be a continuous process. So from the FM side of things, it's not a strategy component that ends the day people return back to the office, but it is now a new role, a new kind of responsibility to continuously improve that space for all the employees that are coming into it.
Right. So you've got this huge shift being driven by the FM about getting the organization ready to welcome workforces back, but then you're going to have this continued period of change and flex as we try and work out exactly what this is going to actually look like for the future. Just coming on to the survey that I mentioned at the start there, I know that you guys have got software options for both landlords and for occupiers. I think, as I understand it, your survey covered both groups, and I just wondered whether you can share any of the kind of key findings that came out of that, any of the sort of differences.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to. And Andy, if you have anything you'd like to add, feel free as well. But yeah, we did a survey for both our landlords as well as our occupiers. We actually did in conjunction with CoreNet Global, an industry organization, to really get a sense and gauge what both sides were thinking. I think that was one of the interesting things from our perspective, servicing both sides of the corporate lease, so to speak. It's interesting how those dynamics might shift and they might change, and based on what it is that they were answering, they may not actually be talking to each other, right? And I think the first thing that really stood out was actually the fact that they are, and that's something that, you know, maybe wasn't in play as much before, but we saw over 75% of landlords increased their communication with their tenants and with the people that were utilizing their properties, which is important, and obviously probably not too much of a surprise. The bigger surprise may be that there's no communication whatsoever for the other 25%. But with that, that communication has increased, but some of their thoughts about this return to work and what it looked like from a actual return perspective and in getting back to a sense of physical normal differed quite a bit. So landlords were actually very optimistic about the return. They were saying that most of their businesses and most of their tenants would be coming back and operating within Q3, where a lot of the tenants favored, a majority in fact, favored a Q4 return. So there's a disconnect of 3 months, which when you start thinking about the renegotiation of leases and what people are actually thinking about with their space, some of that may actually come into play. And I don't want to get these numbers wrong, but 60% here of landlords actually are expecting having to negotiate and renegotiate their lease terms with their tenants. And that has to be coming from some of the disconnects that we're starting to see between the communication between the two about when they actually think that they're going to get back. And a lot of that has to play with how things currently are. No surprise. 72% of tenants thought that less than 25% of their staff are currently on site and would continue to be on site. And most importantly, 71% of the tenants that we surveyed were assuming they were going to need less office space moving forward. And so what is that space? I think that's one of the things that Andy and I and MRI are starting to talk through is the need for less space based on the way that you currently have your facilities set up? Is it maybe the need to increase the space to have bigger meeting rooms and bigger collaborative areas? Are people going to do the hot desking and hoteling where they only come in for certain days and they share desks with other employees? All of these different factors have a lot to say in how that space actually gets utilized. So I think on its face, to say that you need less office space is based on employee counts and people actually coming back. But in reality, the need to change and modify your space for what your employees now need may actually, in some instances, require you to need more space, right? More collaborative space, more socially distant space can change all of those preconceived notions. And that's what we have here with this initial survey. And it's something we're going to go back to in a matter of months to see how things have changed and progressed over time. But what we have now is what people are thinking. And much like I mentioned earlier, that return to work survey we did for our employees was their initial thoughts, right? And now the modifications have to change based on the data. And that's what I think we're going to be seeing here as well. We see that landscape of what it is now, but I see a lot of this stuff probably starting to change in the future as well.
Okay. So, change is something that I think we've all got pretty used to, being pretty dramatic and pretty quick. But just looking at those survey results, Andy, you mentioned there the communication that we are seeing between landlords and occupiers. But where are there perhaps some differences in attitudes to that return to work?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I just kind of, on the back of what Nick said about the survey, what I think what's really interesting is people are saying that they're going to need less space because less people are going to return to the office. But it's one thing saying that, and it's a second thing actually putting that into practice. When perhaps, for instance, let's say you've got an office in the middle of London, you're not necessarily looking to close that office. So you then need to assess how do you kind of renegotiate that lease at some point in the future. And we know that many clients, particularly in that kind of office service kind of industry, they're going to have leases that have a fairly long period of time before they expire, or before there's really an opportunity to actually review or change those lease terms. So then it comes into, well, can you reconfigure that space? How does that work? And from a landlord perspective, I think what they're seeing is that there's still a high demand for space in kind of major areas. Maybe not so much in some of the suburban settings, but certainly in a city like London, for instance, then you've still got that high demand. So there's a really a view that, well, if the space gets reduced, then I'm going to easily be able to lease this out to a new tenant at some point in the future. So I can see why there's some differences between maybe the occupier and the landlord in terms of that environment. I think also, though, what's going to be confusing for occupiers is that we're seeing maybe two attitudes in the workforce. We're seeing some people that say, oh, I never want to go back to the office ever again. I'm happy working at home. The technology is great. It allows me to do so. And I'm fine. I'm productive at home. Then there's others, and I put myself in that category, that can't wait to get back to an office to actually start interacting with people rather than just a laptop and my dog in the background. So I think that we're going to see this kind of bounce back over this year, where there's going to be people looking to return. And I think the Savvy FM team, in conjunction with the board within these organizations, are going to have to do what Nick says, which is assess, well, how do we make this a conducive, collaborative environment for people working together, particularly when we need to overcome some of that kind of virtual meeting fatigue that the people have been going through, and look at how employees are motivated and satisfied kind of longer term, as well as like the shorter term safety and security and compliance concerns. So I think we're definitely going to see that there's going to have to be a continual assessment of these working environments. That in itself causes challenges for many organizations that don't necessarily have the solutions in place to adequately plan for the workspaces that they occupy. And indeed, from an FM perspective, it's certainly going to lead to additional requirements for technology to support that working environment, and the complexity caused by those changing workplace demands as we go ahead, both in terms of the short term and in terms of the longer term. So I think to summarize, that there's clear reason why there's differences in attitudes between the occupier that thinks they may not need that entire workplace moving forwards, and the landlord who's seeing that maybe that practical change in workplace is going to take some time to evolve, and that they will be able, that there's enough demand in the marketplace at the moment with the current economy that they're going to continue to be able to lease out the spaces that they own.
Thanks, Andy. And when you talk about that, when we talk about occupiers trying to work out really what space they need, I mean, that almost sort of suggests, if you think about the models that were rising up in places like WeWork and these kind of flexible spaces, it sort of almost suggests that that's going to kind of lead to a rise in popularity of that kind of setup. Nick, I just wonder what your view is, particularly on that model and how that's going to fare in a kind of post-pandemic world.
Yeah, it's interesting with WeWork specifically, right? That was a solution to a problem, and the problem was people wanted to have a more flexible way to work, right? And there were a lot of people that were working remote, a lot of people that didn't have the collaboration, didn't feel that innovation that you get when you have a bunch of people together. And WeWork found a way to make a solution for people to be able to collaborate and get together, but then also for individuals that may be remote to be able to find flexibility in where they work, not just being remote or work from home, but now having this work from anywhere mentality, right? I think WeWork now becomes this internal movement for a lot of organizations to do kind of their own WeWork model within their properties, right? So again, we've talked about hot desking and hoteling a little bit earlier, but that concept of being able to just go in and to book a desk at your office for the day because you're not there every day. Being able to schedule and being able to go into the office when it makes sense for you for the meetings that you have with your staff. That flexibility is the way people want to work and the way that we've seen internally as well, what our employees are starting to say, where they're saying a hybrid model makes more sense moving forward. And, we were talking with that survey earlier that it was this communication between the occupiers, the tenants, and their landlords. But that's just one stream of communication. Now the tenants of these buildings need to be talking to their employees as well. And, we have the Andy Birches of the world who say they can't wait to get back into an office, right? But then we've seen internally, we've had some of our employees say that having to work remote and work from home has made me a better mom, has made me a better parent because I'm around with my kids more often. We had another employee who has worked remote for us for years and seeing everybody else having to work remote, I now feel more included and more involved in the meetings that we have, because before everybody would be in a room except for them, and they felt like they were missing some of those side conversations in the hall, side conversations at the table in the meeting room. So there are some advantages, right, to having that flexibility. And I think WeWork is the perfect model that can be taken in by some of these businesses, because I think most businesses have seen that they can be productive working remote with their staffs remote. They've found ways to make it work, and people do want to get back and people do want to connect. But I think people also want to have that flexibility now because they've seen how to do it, and a lot of people have been able to thrive and find ways to make both sides work. So to Andy's point, the flexibility of it is what's kind of paramount to this being successful. But in order for all that to work, right, for us to be able to have hot desking, hoteling, being able to book meeting rooms as and when appropriate at your offices, to have flexible schedules, you need to have the right tools in place. You have to have the right technology in place. And as a leader in the properties that you're managing, you have to be able to be prepared for that. And that's the hardest part of all of this, right? Again, I think one thing I've stressed a couple of times is we get these survey results. We know what people think initially, but once everybody does return, and I say everybody does return, and that's completely false, right? When there is a return to work, some people will be coming back, some won't, and we're going to have to continuously shift and adapt. And that's what WeWork had done so well, right? Being able to shift and adapt And also, providing free beer in the facilities probably was a helpful part of their business model as well, right? But having that flexibility and utilizing kind of that WeWork mentality to your own corporate business, I think is actually going to be one of those features and functions when you're recruiting new staff as well, right? People are going to want to know they have that flexibility. At MRI, we're promoting jobs with remote options now, and hybrid models are available for people, which now, as an employer, allows you to cast a much wider net when it comes to new job recruits, right? You don't need people that are centrally located to your offices. If you know that you can function better, you can get the best talent globally, because that location is no longer what matters, right? What matters is the connectivity and the ability to interact and adapt. And having all of this flexibility, more generally speaking, is what's going to put you in front of other employers as well.
Yeah, I think just going on that, the disruption caused by COVID really has been fundamental as a catalyst for changing the expectations really of the occupier, and really to Nick's point about the survey and what we uncovered there, in terms of just generally how human beings we want to be communicated with on a regular basis, so that we understand what's going on, and we can make appropriate decisions. And generally speaking, what we've seen anyway in the real estate industry as a whole is the expectation that we need to change from a lease-centric approach to a client-centric approach. We talked a little bit about WeWork. WeWork is, if we think about it like Uber, Airbnb, Lyft, all of these people, it wasn't really about the technology or even the service itself, what was being provided. It was about improving the customer experience. And I think we're going to see this more in terms of how tenants, occupiers feel about the service that's being provided by their landlords to them, in terms of driving that better experience for the organization and for their employees, and how technology can help in terms of managing that workplace more effectively, and in terms of things like how amenities are provided. And it to some extent, where technology then fits in, is making it easier for the landlord to provide those amenities in a more kind of seamless experience to the occupiers of that building. So, literally someone can have the app on their phone to book out a meeting room or whatever, to request that a particular room gets cleaned, or whatever it might be, or request additional services that the landlord actually, if a savvy landlord can actually start charging a premium for providing things like drinks, food, etc., to a particular office in the building through that same kind of app that they're providing to occupiers to actually book out the space in the first place.
And Andy, what's funny is, before the pandemic hit, one thing that we were talking about in this arena, and one of the big phrases that we were hearing floating around, was space as a service, right? And this came on the heels of WeWork. This came on the heels of all of these different options. And what's funny is that what you would see is that the kind of cons to that model were always that it was going to be harder to bring all of the people together if you don't have them all in a singular office. Offering that sort of flexibility was going to hurt employee productivity. Managers weren't going to be able to keep an eye on the work that their employees were doing. Then the pandemic happened, and space as a service got completely shut down. And now, as these offices start to open back up, as people start returning to office, we're starting to see this space as a service come back up, but with a lot less negative, right? A lot less thoughts that this isn't a go forward type model. And you're absolutely right, Andy. All of these technologies like a WeWork and an Uber, they're disruptors, right? And they disrupt the way that something gets done and usually changes it for the better. And again, I think at the end of the day, we're not talking about going back to normal. We're not talking about full remote working. What we're talking about is this hybrid model that at the end of the day, your employees have the flexibility to be as productive as possible. And therefore, you're utilizing the properties as best fit for your business to be successful and productive moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think space as a service is an interesting one. I think it's probably there's a whole other discussion to be had on that as a concept. We've had a few questions come in, so I was just going to spend a bit of time just putting some of these to you. So, Andy, just thinking about COVID. So, do you think the changes that you're describing will be a long-term shift, or is this a short-term response to COVID?
I think it will be a long-term shift. I think once you set expectations of flexibility, of being able to work in a particular way, I think it's going to be difficult to change to it back to anything else. So I think COVID has been, I think fundamentally all of this was going to happen at some point. It's just COVID has accelerated it. So it's not that COVID has changed things, it's just accelerated the change that was going to happen anyway. So I think that the great thing is that people have the technology to support that change moving forwards. And I think people will adopt technology to help them with that. You know, in the same way as we're all doing that from a consumer perspective at home in terms of how we kind of turn the lights on, how we, you know, set the temperature in the house on our phones, etc., with the latest kind of things like Google Nest and things like that. So I think it's here to stay.
I'd say too, it's not a short-term shift or a long-term shift. It's continuous shifting, right? And that's the piece of being nimble and agile to everything that's changing. Is that it's not like this is the way it's going to be and it's going to stay this way. Well, it's going to continuously shift, and that's environmental external factors. But then you've got to think internally as well. With do we open up more smaller offices to facilitate now more remote people in different pockets? We have that internal process that we have, but then the continuous shifting of everything that's happening from an environmental perspective will continuously cause the FM manager, the HR, even human resources to be very involved with what it is that makes the most sense for their business.
Get comfortable with change, effectively. Nick, if I can just stay with you for a second, one of the another question we've had coming in is just talking about any differences that you're seeing and thinking geographically about any sort of differences city to city, but also from vertical to vertical.
Yeah, so from a city to city perspective, obviously the first thing that we're looking at, and we've kind of started with this almost pyramid type of analysis, is what's the government regulations? What are they starting to look at as we move forward in terms of what these buildings should look like, how these people should work? And one thing that we actually didn't mention earlier is when we're referencing just employees getting to work, one of the things that initially we didn't even think about, but then became an important factor, is which of our offices require public transportation, right? So it's one thing for us to be able to say that we're going to space out our business appropriately, and we're going to have a facility that caters to either social distancing, hand sanitation, larger meeting rooms with distant space, plexiglass walls. But it's another to say, well, wait a minute, these people all drive into the office, and so there's very little issue or interaction, but these other people have to take public transit to get in. So, you know, when we're thinking about the Sydney office, for example, we have a large employee base that go in via transit. The ones that drive were the ones that were much more likely to come in initially. And so that was one of the things that we had to start thinking about. We're thinking about that now with our London office, right? The same thing is, yeah, we don't have easy parking right near where our office is. Everybody's taking transit to get in. And that's going to change and shift what people are thinking and how they're going to react to it as well. So that's one aspect. The other portion of that question, specifically about different industries or sectors, is one thing we've noticed is, especially, and I'll take the United States as an example, manufacturing, industrial type businesses, they've been back to work, right? They've been back to the office. And fortunately enough for them, needing to come back earlier, they're also the type of industry where safety has always been front of mind, right? It's always been about employee safety. So they were already thinking about some of these things pre-COVID. Post-COVID, it was like, well, what are these additional safety measures that we have to bring in? And that actually helps us be able to learn when we're talking to our clients about how that might affect then these additional different sectors as they start to come back as well.
Okay. And if I can come to you, Andy, just thinking again back to the landlord's occupier angle and the potential trend for less space, who do you think will be the losers money-wise, the tenants or the owners?
That's a great question. In terms of who will be the loser money-wise, I don't think. I think that there's going to be there's certainly going to be a shift, because I think that landlords will be forced to evaluate what they're providing to their tenants, and as such, the landlords that invest, you can regard that as maybe losing in the short term, but I don't think it that way. I think of it as gaining in the longer term. The landlords that invest in the appropriate systems, put in place the appropriate mechanisms to support their occupier needs, will actually win in the long term and ensure that they retain those tenants. I think tenants generally, it's an interesting one, because tenants to some extent will maybe have to mitigate the safety of employees against the fact that they're going to have to take up additional space potentially as they meet kind of safety concerns or kind of restructure the office. But again, I think the employee satisfaction and ultimately then the productivity of the organization far outweighs any kind of immediate cost that they might be incurring as a result of this.
And Andy, one thing to add on to that is, if you think about an office building, right? And you have a centralized lobby, and then you have your actual individual tenants on the different floors maybe of that office. If you don't have good communication between the tenant and what they're doing to ensure safety for the employees, and the owner of the actual property who has to maintain the centralized lobby, the employee may not even want to go into your office if they don't feel safe in the common areas of the building, right? So now you actually have duty on both sides to ensure safety of the ultimate, let's just say, visitor that's entering the building to go to work at that actual office building. So we've talked about that communication piece earlier between landlords and tenants, and a lot of that was around maybe the negotiation of lease terms. But if you actually think about the end benefit for your client's client as a landlord, it all comes down to ensuring that whole journey into the office and then into the actual individual level or floor of that building is important to maintain that consistency. Or again, you're finding ways to make your employee feel like they'd rather work from home than in the buildings that you're providing.
Thanks. We've got more questions coming in, so staying with the audience. Andy, if I can come to you, what about the adoption of hub and spoke? Is the only way to achieve this via WeWork or a flexible office, or will local office demand grow? What do you think?
I think local office demand will grow. I think there will be, people have got to make a holistic assessment of all of their employee requirements. And I think as a result, I think that there will be demand for local offices. the concern there probably from an organization is, well, how do I manage this all from a technology perspective as much as anything else? And the answer to some extent is that, you know, we've seen a shift, not just with our systems, but I'm talking generally in the market towards, you know, cloud-based software solutions, solutions that people can access from anywhere. So providing the organization has made appropriate steps in terms of their IT strategy, then I think they can easily support these requirements, and we will see that shift towards a more kind of localized office environment. It really depends to some extent on the industry and sector. It's difficult, you know, maybe if you've got like a major financial company that has premises in the middle of London, where they have a high number of kind of investors or whatever visiting the organization, it's going to be difficult for someone like that to change. But other organizations where maybe a lot of the services that they're providing are done somewhat remotely anyway, then they can easily shift to like the local office model.
Okay. And another question is coming in, and Nick, just thinking a bit about what you were describing with the considerations beyond the workspace and things like transports. Do you see governments encouraging or influencing the shift back to commuting to support commercial infrastructure recovery?
Yeah, and I think the one thing that really matters with that specifically is what the actual, not at the highest level, but what some of these city governments are looking at. And utilizing again the U.S. as an example, a little closer to home for me. One place that really struggled, you know, a lot of businesses shut down, but what you'll see is that a lot of companies that have organized their businesses into industrial parks or to areas with a lot of different corporate areas all together, they typically almost have their own ecosystem of restaurants, of dry cleaners, of places that the employees would populate either at lunchtime or right before or after work. And those are the places that are going to struggle the most in returning from an infrastructure perspective, because they don't have the typical residents within those industrial areas to help supplement their business, right? So you actually see a big push towards making sure that these businesses bring their employees back. And that has to be a factor to this as well. But it's beyond just those individual corporate offices. It becomes this whole entire ecosystem that's no longer necessary. And one thing that we've seen too is as people now feel like their businesses are going to be more comfortable with them working remote, that you see this shift of people leaving the big cities and starting to move towards the suburbs where home prices are cheaper, and they know that they don't have to drive in to the office every day. So living in a big city is no longer necessary. If that's already happened, it's going to be very difficult for you to get your employees to be forced back into the business one way or the other. So now you're stuck having to either incentivize them or continue to provide these flexible options to make sure that that's an okay, you know, situation for them and that they're fine with those circumstances. But there's a lot of different moving parts in play that now these cities have to actually determine how they keep either these businesses running and functioning or have to reevaluate the space from an entire infrastructure perspective. Because that's the one thing that we've seen, especially with home prices, is they're starting to skyrocket, but especially in the suburb areas as people start to move out. And that then factors and shifts into all of the different businesses that surround those different communities.
Thanks, Nick. I'm going to put one more question to Andy, and then I think I'll come to you both for closing remarks. Andy, you mentioned sustainability as something that's likely to come back onto the agenda potentially towards the end of this year. But just have you got any view on how the hybrid model will work with sustainability in mind?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot more need for smart controls in buildings, etc. You know, that's like the first obvious thing there is that, you know, in order to ensure that the building is heated properly, etc., that there's going to be a need for better, more intelligent control over that. And this is not just I've walked into a corridor and suddenly the lights come on. This is actually planning for usage of space. So as someone books a desk or plans to be in the office Tuesday or Thursday, but not Wednesday this week, it's a case of, well, how does the energy controls work in that particular environment? I'm based in Toronto and it gets very cold in the middle of winter. So I don't just want the heating to come on as I walk into, the office that I'm using. I'm going to have wanted it to preheat for a little while. So there's going to be plans around how that energy usage works, and it is controlled intelligently so that it minimizes the cost to the organization, but provides the appropriate kind of working environment for the employee. It's going to be interesting, as we look at this. There was a big push towards sustainability over the last few years, and we've seen the various kind of carbon tax programs put in place. I foresee that there's going to be an increased emphasis on taxation to organizations, as the taxing of personal energy consumption is going to be kind of a political minefield. So probably people are going to stay away from that, at least from the short term, as like individuals kind of recover from COVID. But organizations, I suspect, will be more heavily taxed around this area longer term. And so it's particularly important for organizations to be smart with that energy usage. That will factor in, particularly in those kind of hybrid situations.
Thanks, Andy. And thanks everybody for submitting questions. I think that's been a really rich discussion. Nick, I just wondered if I can come to you for any closing remarks.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that we've definitely highlighted is the communication aspect, right? It's really easy to rely on what we think should happen, or just factor in what we're being told as how the return to office should look, what the return to work should look like for your business based on what you actually hear. But the communication lines, we've discussed them in different ways. And one of them is the landlord and the tenant, but then the other needs to be that you as a tenant with your employees, right? And those may be differing opinions on what we want to do, how we want to move forward, how we want to proceed. And having that communication line open needs to occur beyond just the return to work. And I think that's the big point from my perspective, is it's not a one and done. You will return to office, you will get back to a semblance of normal, but then you will continuously modify and improve your facilities to make sure that you're gaining the most out of the business physical presence that you do have.
Thanks, Nick. And Andy, a lot in this discussion, but how would you draw your conclusions?
Well, I think people need to look at what they have access to. To Nick's point, communication is going to be key, but that communication needs to be intelligent. So it needs to be based on the fact that they've got access to the data in order to run the business and that workspace more intelligently. So that's going to involve them being able to collect that data through technology to support that. So through kind of integrated FM solutions that will help them plan that space in the first place, to set it up correctly to meet employee demands and business demands, through to the scheduling and management of that space on an ongoing basis. So looking at how rooms are booked, how it's scheduled in terms of hybrid workforces coming in, who comes in on what day, and so on. And then finally, assessing the utilization of that space. So intelligently looking at who came in, who was in the building, so checking people presence within that building, whether that's an employee, whether that's a contractor, whether that's a visitor, and managing that intelligently so that people can reassess that space and make decisions about the ongoing requirements that they have for the organization as a whole. So I think people that put in place the appropriate mechanisms to capture that data will gain significant advantage through that data-driven analysis that they can get from that technology, and allow them to optimize their use of that space on an ongoing basis.
Thanks both, and thanks for your expert opinions and for taking the questions today. I do think that made for a fantastic discussion, and if you'd like to get a copy of that survey that we referred to several times throughout the discussion, just remember it's available on that download link that you can see in your window now. For those of you that'd like to know more about MRI software, you're viewing this through Facility Show Connect. If you visit the if you click on the exhibitor tab at the top, you'll be able to find MRI software, and you can view information about the company, the products, but also actually request and set up virtual meetings. Thanks to everyone in the audience. Thanks for your questions, your participation. And within the next 24 to 48 hours, today's discussion will be available to watch on demand through Facility Show Connect. Feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who haven't perhaps been able to watch today and get them involved. In addition to our focus on FM this week, we also have content and supplies from our other co-located shows covering security, health and safety, fire safety, well-being, and intelligent buildings throughout June. But that's all from this session. Thanks everyone for your time, and have a great day.
Thanks.